I'm not interested in like being big, right? Like what I'm interested in is being able to live my life in a way to live in liberation, to be, right? And so like my work allows me, as long as I continue to like nurture that and move towards that, allows me to speak from the heart and allows me to do work that I really feel in my heart can be helpful to my community. For me, liberation is like being able to create my own approaches with my community, with my friends, with my family, to be able to spend my time the way that I want it, to read a book, to travel. Those are the things that matter to me rather than like clout or so even when I'm strategically pursuing that or positioning myself in a way to get that, it's always with an end that's not about that. It's like a tool to get to a place of liberation.
Mi gente, what's good? Dímelo, dímelo. Welcome to another episode of the Quién Tú Eres podcast brought to you by Plural. You already know, it's your boy Pavel, bringing you another special episode with another very special guest. As a reminder, on this podcast, our mission is to redefine professionalism because it feels like we've been trained our entire lives to believe that who we are authentically is unprofessional and inappropriate for the workplace. That's not true, though. We're here to help you unlearn that so that you can be your most authentic self at work. Each week, we have a different guest join us for a very candid conversation around their experience between professionalism and authenticity. Speaking of guests, the clip that you heard in the intro is with this week's guest, Victor Alfonso Cabral, who is a collaborative and strategic Afro-Latinx leader who is committed to making an impact in his community and beyond. These days, Victor serves as the Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs for Fluence Training. Victor works to center BIPOC voices in the field of psychedelics by highlighting BIPOC stories in policy, advocacy efforts, art, and science. He's actually currently working on a documentary film titled We Are the Medicine, which explores the reemergence of psychedelics from the perspective of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Based on all of the work that he's done, Victor has actually been listed on Students for Sensible Drug Policy's list of 40 under 40 outstanding BIPOC leaders, specifically for his work on psychedelic policy. In addition to that, he's received the 2022 Emerging Social Worker Leader Award from the National Association of Social Workers. To get a full bio, please be sure to check out the show notes and the episode description of this week's episode. Now that you have a little bit more context into who Victor is, let's get into this dope conversation. All right, so let's start off with the word authenticity. It's such a buzzword, yet when you hear the word, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think authenticity is operating from your most like your core true self as much as you can, right? And so for me, it's moving through the world in a way that's connected to my values, that's connected to who I am when I'm not with anyone, right? And how much of that I can bring out to the world, right? And so it's moving through the world in a way that's like being rather than performing.
Oh, I like that. Being instead of performing. So, all right, when you was growing up, was it easy to live in that definition?
Nah, not at all. And I think it was like for me, it was evident at a young age for me that I was different. And I'm neurodivergent, and I've always been kind of like emotionally attuned and always have been kind of very relational. And so that's cool when you're like, maybe in elementary school, like early on, but as you get older, and you go into middle school and high school, there's more pressure for you to kind of, find a group that you're a part of and blend in with that and become that, right? So I think it was it was hard. It was like I for safety reasons probably I made a decision to just pretend and perform, right? I think we all do at some point, and then you get lost in that and you forget, right? And so it was difficult when I was a kid for several reasons. So one is just it's just kind of I think like part of development in this country and in the systems that we live in to do that as a kid. And then it's then authenticity wasn't really something that was valued in
Yeah.
society.
Go back to being neurodivergent, because I think that's something that people often hear but don't really know what it means as well. So when you say that you're neurodivergent, what does that mean?
Yeah, I have ADHD, and I hate labeling myself with that, but I mean it's something that helps conceptualize like what it is that I struggle with. But really, a lot of executive functioning stuff for me is really difficult when it comes to organization, time management, impulse control, things like that. I have inattentive ADHD versus hyperactive, which is the differentiation that they make. And I also feel I'm pretty much know now that I'm older that like by definitions of like educational definitions that I was gifted and that I probably fell through the cracks, right? So like kids of color who are gifted are generally not identified as such. And so for me, usually what you see with those kids is that they start to misbehave because they're bored or they're trying you're trying to fit them into an educational system that's not for them, and so they start to act out in different ways. For me, I just shut down. And so yeah, and in that sense I think I'm probably like neurodivergent. I have ADHD, and I also have learned differently than other people. And yeah.
Well, it's not even that like you just automatically shut down. And maybe I'm making up a story in my head, but I would imagine that, I don't know, maybe you're in class and you are, like you said, maybe bored, having trouble in focus, and maybe you're doing something else, right? And by you shutting down, maybe that was a result of someone telling you like, stop doing all that other stuff, focus on this. Meanwhile, like you're having trouble doing it, and then as a response, you shut down. What was some of that early feedback that you received where you were just like, they don't understand what I'm going through?
Yeah, it was early. It was in like elementary school. So one thing is there was a lot going on in my life. So like I have a lot of childhood trauma stuff, and so there was that piece of it. And then just not feeling like I was fitting into the classroom or the educational system. So I would just like zone out, right? But one of my earliest memories, which I have thought about a lot, is that I had a teacher who would give us homework, and it was like 5 times each. They would make you like do each spelling word 5 times on a piece of paper, and then you had to hand it in the next day. And for me, like I really didn't have any educational support at home, on top of the fact that I was like, now in hindsight, right, I was neurodivergent. So I had some issues around like executive functioning and self-starting, and needed that support. And so I wouldn't do my homework, and then they would like double it every day. So it would be like 10 times each, then 15 times each, then 20 times each, then like 50 times each, right? Like it would like just to the point where like eventually I just wouldn't do it and I would fail my classes. And that still comes back to haunt me sometimes, like that anxiety around like writing, or anxiety around like certain like assignments or stuff like that, like when I was in graduate school and undergrad. Like I remember that feeling, or like that of like feeling helpless and nobody was responding to my needs in terms of needing more support. And then like when I was growing up, when you got S on your report card, like you got beat up right when your report card came. So it was like, instead of saying, oh, this kid needs more support, or that he needs more support with these things, it was like piled on, right? So it was like the failure and like the not fitting in, not being able to do the work, and then on top of that, like corporal punishment. So that like over time really, I think, took a toll.
Yeah, I mean, you bringing back memories of being in middle school. I remember kids post like parent teacher conference, like that next day back in school, like kids used to roll up their pants and be like, look at the scars type of stuff. And yeah, I remember that. I mean, I think I fit in decently within the educational system. Looking back at it, I definitely see the way that I was taught, and I wish that it could have incorporated like other ways of learning. For example, like I hate reading. I don't know what it is, but I have such a difficult time with reading comprehension. Most often, while like when people ask me like, "Oh, how many books have you read?" Yo, probably like 3, because if I read one page, I need to read that one page like 3 times. 'Cause I'll literally go through it and be like, "Yo, what was that about?" And literally have to read it over. And in any of those type of classes, which was like every class, you have to read about different subjects and regurgitate the information. I struggled so much. Like, I wish back in the day there was like the audio format, because I could listen to podcasts forever. You know what I mean? And I think, yeah, it's really interesting to think about it. There is many times only one way to teach people. Not that there is, but that's how we teach kids, as if there is only one way.
Yeah, and then you're punished for any other
Yeah.
like way you try to get around that, right? So same thing for me. I have trouble with reading books, and that's part of my neurodivergence. It's like mild dyslexia too. So audiobooks like have really been like, once audiobooks came out and that became a thing like 10, for me anyway, like 10 years ago around there, that's when I really started to like read a lot of books. But before then, it was the same. It was difficult. And so again, like when I think about school, it was like, we would be reading Shakespeare, reading like all this other stuff, and it wasn't going well for me. So yeah, I think, the educational system like really had an effect on me. And later on, I think a positive one because of the way that I managed it. But for a long time, it was like it took me to graduate school to be able to start to be confident in, oh, like I'm able, I have like intelligence and I can do these things. But it took till then for me to start feeling confident in myself in some way.
Yo, even the idea of when people say, how many books have you read? If I listened to an entire book, there's still an idea in my head that I didn't get the information properly. It's literally the same thing. If I listen to the book or read the book, as long as I'm pulling the information out of it, it's fine. But there's still a stigma in my head that's not equivalent to someone reading the book. You know what I mean? Is that something you struggle with too?
Yeah, I mean, if I would turn my camera around here, like you would see like I have a whole reading library. Like I have a lot of books because I have tried to force myself in
Me
the past
too. I
to
want to
read.
show you my thing too. There's 20 books that I've all bought from Amazon, and they're just like for display. They just look
Yeah,
nice.
yeah. So yeah, there's always if I really want to read a book and I have complete silence and I'm chilling and maybe I'm in like a really relaxing place, I might be able to get in some reading. But generally, it's just audiobooks are like the thing for me. And I find myself always trying to go back to like, nah, I need to read like sometimes I'll buy the audiobook
Yeah.
and the physical copy and sit there and try to like I have or like sit there and try to listen and read at the same time, like the physical copy of it. Um,
Oh, just to
but
be able to say, I'm with y'all.
yeah,
I did it
yeah,
too.
it's just I have this love for books generally. I think it's just like what they represent. I think, and so there's always this desire for me. And then like my little girl, she's 10 now. She's about to be 11, and she reads like ridiculous amount of books a week. Like I told her I was gonna give her $10 a book, and now I'm just like, yeah, I think we revisit the deal.
You broke, man. You
Yeah,
probably be like, how about a hug, a book? I don't know.
yeah. So I sometimes I want to read with her, you know what I mean, or sit down and read
Mm.
to her and stuff like that. So it's more about these days. I really don't. It doesn't bother me as much, but I think before it was like, why can't I, read this entire chapter book in a week like someone else can, and it would mess with me. But now it's just like, there's so many ways to get information,
Yeah. Shout out
and
to technology.
yeah, for sure.
Well, you said something interesting. You were like, it took me until grad school to feel, I think you said the word capable or intelligent or any of those things. Like, how old were you when that happened? And then what was it in that moment that kind of switched for you, where you started to feel more confident?
So I finished grad school in 2019. So I'm 35 now. So what that was like 4 years ago, I would have been 31. So I when I went to undergraduate, I failed out of undergraduate in like 2010. I lost my financial aid because I wasn't making academic progress. I was evicted from my apartment. I was at the time like struggling with my weight. I was like severely overweight. I was having health issues, and and then I like piecemealed my degree together over 8 years. So I got my undergrad in 2018 and 2014 finally. And then when I tried to go to graduate school, like I was getting rejected, like sometimes harshly by like chairs of departments, like you don't belong in graduate school until Dr. Phyllis Black, who's like a pioneer in ethics and social work, she gave me an interview and accepted me on the spot when she heard like the story that I had to tell. And when I got into the program, the like majority of social workers are in programs are white women. And so I was like one of a couple people of color that were there, and just struggling to be like, do I belong here? Am I like, I was struggling keeping up with the readings, like the journal articles and all of that stuff, struggling keeping up with papers and writing. And I think what changed it for me for real was that there was an older Dominican woman from that she had just come here from DR like a few years, her master's degree in social work, and I was a Puerto Rican man, and like a couple Puerto Rican folks, and then that one Dominican woman. And one day I was just like, yo, I haven't read any of this stuff, and I haven't done my papers or done any of it. And everybody was like, we ain't doing none of that shit either. And then I was like, yo. And that's when I realized, because I was so shut down and so to myself and so to in this story of I don't belong, and like and I was holding on to that all by myself. And when I shared it and everybody else was like, yeah, me too, bro, like it like released me from that. And then I was able to start finding ways to make it work for me, and then succeeding in that. And so like I went from graduating with my bachelor's with like 2.4, I think, or something like that, to a 3.6, 3.7 in my master's degree without cracking a book open. And because I figured out how to play the game, right? Like how to play the educational game, and how to make it work for me and the style that I wanted to learn and the way that I wanted to do things.
Tell me a little bit more about that. Like when you say like you learned how to play the game, but also it sounds like you found community where y'all were able to share game amongst each other. So what are some of the things that you learned that made it work for you, that you went from a 2 something to a 3 something?
Yeah, so I think I learned so part of my story earlier on in my life was that when I got to middle school, I started playing basketball for the school. And so if I didn't have the grades, I couldn't play. So that at that point it was like I need to figure out how to get these grades together so I could play ball. And so I learned that if they weren't going to give me the support that I needed, that I was going to have to be like I was going to have to do it on my own. And so like through high school, I went from like when I went into high school, I was one section behind. They had like sections in my school. I was one section behind being in like a special education class. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but the message that I was getting is you're not going to be able to get into college if you're like in these classes. And so by the time I graduated, I had forced my guidance counselor to put me in like accelerated courses. A school would start at 8:45. I would be at the school at 7:30 looking for the professor or the teacher that taught chemistry so they could teach me how to like do all that electron proton stuff, and like that I didn't understand. So I learned how to be like resourceful and how to like figure things out on my own because I didn't have the support. So in college, I started doing the same thing and was like, oh, I don't have to read this 30-page paper to understand like what the main idea is. I could just like scan it, right? And find what makes sense and then intuitively put together like what it means. And so that's when I started to feel more confident in myself because it came easy to me to be able to fill in those gaps without needing to read 200 pages every week. I could
Yeah.
just look at the concepts, understand them generally, abstractly, and then be able to fill in the gaps with like my life experience and the work that I was doing in my community. And then once I started noticing, okay, I'm like, sometimes I'm contributing things in the class that weren't being contributed, or like I'm bringing new perspectives. It started to be like, okay, like I'm on to something, and like I have something to offer, even though I don't do things like everybody else is doing them.
That's a powerful sort of like scenario too. Like you go from feeling like an imposter and you don't belong to actively contributing class. I want to go back to that moment where like maybe you first started contributing in class. Like talk to me about the fears that probably went in your head. Oh, they're probably not gonna take me seriously. I'm not gonna make any sense. Or am I worthy of having an opinion in this class? Did you have any of those sort of like fears and anxieties?
Yeah, for sure. So my second year, I ended up transferring to the school I went to had like satellite campuses. And so I transferred out of the campus where I had that community that I had formed, and transferred to a campus that was in the sticks, right? And it was just like me and I was the only male in the class, and then there was like two people of color, and then everybody else was like white. Something that happened for me is there was always this fight between being raised not to be smart and raise your hand and answer questions in class, right? Or not being raised like that, but experiencing that in school, right? Like you didn't want to be the smart kid, right? You didn't want to be the kid that knew the answers and was raising his hands all the time. Going from
Yeah.
that to
Being
like,
a geek was not being a geek was not cool.
yeah. And I experienced it even in undergrad, right? Sometimes. And so going into graduate school, it was kind of this other thing where I didn't feel worthy of being in the room with these folks or like of contributing. But I remember I had transferred to that campus because I built a relationship with the research methods professor because we went to India together. And the first class, she was asking questions about the scientific method and, positive and negative relationships with variables, etc. And I had been such a geek on my own time around like looking into like physics and just like different kinds of science, and like I eat all that stuff up like on my own, like Lawrence Cross, and like watching debates with Christopher Hitchens and like all of these different people. And so a lot of that stuff just made immediate sense to me, and I remember like being able to answer all those questions immediately in class before we even got started. And the reaction from like my fellow classmates was like, I thought this is something that everybody else knows and I'm just like contributing it, but it felt like, oh man, this guy knows something. And I'm like, okay, well, it just made me feel like, okay, like I do know something, right? It wasn't like a grandiose thing where I was like, I'm the smartest person in the class now, right? But it was like the realization of I'm not an idiot, right? And just because I grew up in the hood and like I didn't get the same education as these folks and I don't have the same resources, it doesn't mean that I don't have ability and that I don't have intelligence. I just access it in a different way and it looks different.
Do you think, because I think there's like a duality of feelings that in that experience that probably happened, and maybe this is just me projecting on my own experience, but I think when you share your opinion and viewpoint and it lands, I think people are impressed, right? And you're like, all right, yeah, I belong here, but also people are a little bit maybe surprised. People are like, oh shit, I didn't expect him to say that.
You
To put,
thought
yeah. Did you get a sense of both of those feelings?
not in that context, but definitely all the time. Yeah, I get that all the time now. It's like where people have a certain impression of me, and then when we have a conversation and it goes down like a philosophical route, or it goes down like something really technical, or like policy, right, where it's like really complicated and layered. I get that, oh shit, kind of
People give you
reaction.
that look. Do people like say anything as well, or is it just like a reaction?
I mean, yeah, not so much anymore, right? But I'm also like more inclined to like ask for clarification if somebody tells me like you're so articulate, right, or something like that. But I've heard
But
those terms all the time of you're like I'm not supposed to be articulate or I'm not supposed to be like
people
um
have told you that you're not supposed to be
no
articulate.
no, but it's implied, right? It's kind of like this underhanded thing of, oh my God, you're so articulate. I didn't expect you to be, right? That's the tone of the reaction. So yeah, but not I don't think I experience it so much anymore. But again, like I work remotely and the field that I work in is I know a lot of the people already. So I'm sure that if I was in another context or in another place, like sometimes I'm speaking to legislators or like folks that I don't know, and you can tell that there's an initial kind of like the first time I showed up to a press conference, right, to speak with like dreadlocks and my tattoos, right, and like all this stuff and like the looks that you get, and then you see the transition when you start speaking or start imparting knowledge, then like that shifts, and you can sense that. I can anyway.
When did you start embracing how you look these days? Like you mentioned, your hair, tattoos. I see piercings. I'm assuming at one point you kind of hit a lot of those things, and then at some point you started embracing them step by step. Like what? When was that change for you?
So I feel like there was always a desire to. I've always been into tattoos. Like I see it as an art form. I see it like and dreadlocks, and but there was this fear of like how I was going to be perceived, right? And so when I graduated in 2019, I got a fellowship with the governor of Pennsylvania. I got selected. I was the first male of color to be selected for that. It was me. and me and a woman were the only people of color that were selected out of, I don't know, it was 13 of us total. And I got into into this governor's fellowship, and I was put in the department of DHS in the executive offices. And I got one suit. Like, I still only have one suit. I'm gonna be real with you.
Yeah.
So, people are dressing up in suits every day. This is like high level government stuff, that work that I've never done before. There's not a lot of people that look like me. So I'm battling, like, feeling kind of out of place. But when I graduated, I started to grow my hair out, right? With the intention of doing braids in my hair.
And when you graduated, was that your validation? You were like, oh, at least I graduated. I could, if somebody questions me, this is my, hey, I'm capable kind of thing.
No, it was more so, it was just like, I want to grow my hair out. And like, I had braids when I was younger, and I had more awareness around the history of like our hair as part of the African diaspora and all of that. So I was like, I want to grow my hair out. But I was doing it, but like, I was still scared. Like, I was growing it out, but there was no guarantee that it was going to go anywhere. But then one day, this was like 2020. I want to say it was 2019, maybe. I braided my hair after, going back and forth in my head of being scared. And at that point, I was like, fuck it, I'm going to braid it and let these white people look at me however they want. So I braid it, and I show up to work, and I'm in the elevator, and there's a woman and a man. And then there's my colleague, a good friend of mine, who's a queer white woman, or gay white woman. And we always chilling. Like, she's like an ally, I trust her. We talk a lot. And while I'm in the elevator, the dude says to me, like, "Oh, you look very nice today." Mind you, like, everyone there wore suits that day. I couldn't wear my suit every day, so I just had a button up and a tie. And I'm like, okay, like, whatever. And then the lady turns to me and she goes, "Do you dress up for work every day?" And I'm like, in the moment, I didn't catch it. I'm like, whatever. We get off the elevator, and then my friend stops me, and she was like, "Did you like?" She's just like checking in with me. I'm like, and then I thought about it, and I'm like, "Oh, she like, why would she ask me that? Like, everyone else has a tie on and a shirt, and but because I had cornrows in my hair, right? It was like, you must be dressing up for an occasion. There's no way that like you actually work here." That's what it came across as. So that I went through that, like, exacerbated my like the anxiety and all of that I was going through. But then it angered me, and then at that point I was like, okay, now I'm gonna grow this shit out. And then I was actually promoted out of the office that I was in directly into the governor's office, and had a boss that was like really supportive and really, grew up in the hood, and understood kind of like the background that I came from, and just allowed space for me to be who I was. And that's when I like, I started my dreads, I pierced my nose. And then in my relationship with him, he gave me a promotion. And then I started showing, then he started to be like, I can't make it to this press conference, and send me to go speak. And then I would
Whoa.
show up, with like my dreads and all this, and people were like looking at me like, what the hell, and then, but then I would speak. And then those invites got even more frequent. And for me, there was something about like showing up in that way, and showing people like, I got tattoos, I got piercings, I got dreadlocks, and I'm still here like doing this, and I'm doing it just as good or better than the people that are standing here.
That's fascinating, that moment of a weird comment or awkward interaction. Like, I feel like a lot of people, that would make them do the opposite of what you did. Like, I feel like most people would start hiding, maybe cut off their braids or do something. And for you, it's fascinating that in so many instances throughout your early years, if you feel like not capable and all of these things, there you were, and it made you angry enough to say fuck it.
Yeah, like, I wasn't there. Another thing is, going into that role, like, there was a lot of responsibility that I took on my shoulders, or like, I need to like represent, and I need to do the work while I'm here for like my community. That's what I wanted to do. That's just why I took this job and I came here. And so like, part of that is like also the image and how I showed up. So like, beyond just like this, like I showed up to a press conference, like we established the first racial day of healing in Pennsylvania history, and I took my daughter up to the podium with me when I spoke. You know, the first lady of Pennsylvania was there, like my boss was there, and I brought my daughter with me, and she stood right next to me while I told, you know, while I talked about like our heritage and like all the people that have suffered for us to be able to be here today and all of that. So it was like I was on this mission to like really make the most impact that I could. And at some point I stopped caring about longevity in a government job because I didn't feel like it was my path anyway. So I was like, I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do, and the impact that I want to make is gonna come from me showing up authentically, right? So I don't do talking points, right? I would write my own speeches, or I like would show up with my own narrative around what I was speaking about. And that's and for me, like the way that I perceive it is exactly what happened, right? Like people really embrace that.
Oh, tell me a little bit about that. You said, because I think oftentimes we talk about sort of these negative experiences and the negative thoughts that come into our heads around like the worst case scenarios, but it sounds like you were also embraced positively by a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, like my direct, you know, the person I was reporting to directly, his name's Dan German. It's like a wonderful human being, like one of the best bosses I've ever had in my life, was in my corner and was also showing up very authentically and also challenging the way things were being done. And so, uh,
Oh, tell me about that. What did
yeah,
he do that you were like, yo, this guy's dope? If he could do it, I could do it.
yeah, I mean, he would just, you know, it wasn't like a, yeah. So he would just like, he would just call shit out and say, this isn't working. We need to like, or this process is way too slow and people need help. Or like, why are we spending $70,000 a year to put a kid in foster care when you can give their parents $1,000 so they could keep the roof over their head instead of splitting up the family and traumatizing them. So, and he was very passionate about that because it was his experience as a kid, right? So like he was like, I so I strategically got myself put in that office because I saw him speak somewhere about like how his mom was still working at Walmart and all this stuff, and I was like, this is the dude. He understands like what we're here to do. And then everybody around me that mattered, right? Like my community, my colleagues that were on the same mission as me, like I felt their embrace and I felt the encouragement from them, and that's what mattered the most to me, right? In terms of like understanding or being able to show up in a way that was impactful, and that, you know, when a kid was watching the news or picked up a newspaper and saw me up there with like my dreadlocks and all of that, they were like, I could see myself reflected in that.
Yeah. I mean, there you said a couple things that is powerful. Is of course you're gonna feel more comfortable being yourself in those environments where there's a level of like psychological safety, right? Like you don't have to worry about how you show up when your manager is already supportive and telling you like, nah, I got your back. And he's not only saying it, but he's modeling the behavior that you essentially want for yourself. Like I often get the question like, yo, how do you get people to share their life experiences around like the workplace and all these things? And I'm like, they share it with me because I'm very vulnerable in my experience. If people respect that, so they mirror and model that behavior. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, like that time that I spent with Dan, who at the time he was the executive director of the governor's office of advocacy and reform, was like the most growth I've experienced professionally in my life, right? And it was because here was this person that was like, be yourself, and who you are
Yeah.
is like is valuable to this office and to the work that we're gonna do together. And I still have a relation. I just talked to him like 2 3 days ago. He's the CEO of an organization in Florida now, and he's working down there with kids that have like complex medical issues. But like the growth that I experienced gave me a level of, I didn't fear the system anymore because I knew that even if the system came back and came after me, like I trusted that he was gonna protect me, and he also set me up. So like as soon as I got there, the conversation was about like, what's your trajectory and like
Mm-hmm.
where what's the plan to put you like where you need to be at so that this job becomes something that catapults you into something more, that's more that's bigger for you. And that's exactly what happened, like in the time that I was there. And then we ended up leaving within a week of each other, right? He
Wow.
left, either he left and then I left immediately after, or the other way around. But it was like once we did the work that we were going to do and we grew together and we did what we were going to do, we both moved on to the next thing.
Wow. And speaking of the next thing, I think it's fascinating some of the work that you're doing these days because listen, if I tell my abuela that I'm smoking hookah, she thinks I'm a drug addict. So the fact that you're doing so much work to destigmatize, but also raise awareness for a possible solution for many people when it comes to just like supporting their daily lives in the world of psychedelics. So you're not the only one, but you are doing a lot of work in there. There's so many potential stigmas around that and whatnot. Like, how do you grapple with that? Or at this point, you're just like, listen, this is what I'm interested in. I don't really care what people think. They're just like, how do you think about all those things?
Yeah, so this was all like intentional for me. So I had my first experience with psilocybin in 2016, right before I went into graduate school. So that also helped me through like graduate school. I didn't mention that. So
Interesting. Okay.
that was a shift for me, and I knew that I wanted to do this work. So like through graduate school, I did like my graduate research on psychedelics. I got trained as a therapist in psychedelics like throughout the years. I worked on psychedelic legislation while I was in the governor's office. I educated people in the state about psychedelics, and it was scary as shit. Honestly, when I was in the governor's office, like I didn't talk about psychedelics as adamantly and as openly as I do right now. But I knew that
Well,
I was going to, because I knew I wouldn't have, it's just I work in the governor's office, right? So it's, right, anything that I say or do is going to be tied back to the governor. And so, and this was like during, the elections, and Pennsylvania was like wilding, right? So for me, it was very intentional. And when I got to the point where it was like, okay, my boss is leaving, I know I don't want to stay here. I know that I'm not going to be able, like, I could transition somewhere else and make more money, but I can't stay here because I'm not going to be able to continue to be myself. Is when I made the jump out, right, of state government, and very intentional. Like, I already knew, like, I'm a licensed therapist. I've worked for the governor's office and did good work in that, right? I have community recognition, I have statewide recognition because of the visibility of the job that I was doing. And so I think I have enough credibility that when I start to talk about these things, people are going to listen. And so I quit the governor's office on Friday. Saturday, I started filming a documentary on psychedelics. Monday, I was on Sway in the Morning talking about psychedelics. We dropped an article that week in NPR on psychedelics. And then it was all very, very intentional, with it, keeping in mind, that the risk that I was taking. So as that was happening, there was like a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear. But now it's just, I made a career, in this, and there's no turning back, right? So I'm already in. So yeah.
I didn't know that there was like a personal tie to it around a positive impact that you had with that.
Oh yeah.
And no wonder why you're like, oh shit, well, it's kind of like the model behavior that you had with your manager at the time was like, whoa, he's doing it, it's working for him, let me try it. Now you're like, whoa, I tried this, it's working for me, let me help other people with it.
Yeah, with psychedelics, it's like when you talk about authenticity, in my experience with psychedelics, right? For me, it helped me really get in touch with my core self, right? And really shed a lot of the programming. And so I knew immediately, I was working as a therapist in the hood. So I'm seeing like how people are being put on 4 and 5 medications, on, with PTSD for 5, 6 years, not getting any better. And then I'm somebody who's suffering from depression, anxiety, ADHD, all of these things. And I have this amazing experience that really changed my life, quite frankly. And I knew like this is a medicine that could really be supportive to our communities. And so my goal and my passion and my mission now is just to like empower, not empower, but to educate and to share so that people can make their own decisions, because these things are coming, right? MDMA is going to be a legal therapy by mid 2024. Psilocybin is going to follow behind that. The American Medical Association just approved the first codes for psychedelic assisted therapy. There's 25 plus states across the country passing legislation around psychedelics. And so for me, it was just like, yeah, it changed my life. It's in so many different ways that I could get into, and we need to like educate our community so that they're ready to engage with these things in the way that they feel, in a decolonized way, right? And not in the way that they is spoon fed by the people in the ivory towers, as they say, right?
Yeah, I mean, that could be a whole other episode.
Yeah.
But as we wrap up, because we're running out of time, listen, like your reach is getting larger. You're being seen by more people, bigger audiences, different audiences. I don't know. Some people say it's easier as they move up because they can call their own shots. Now you're not working for, some government where you have to worry about their perception. Some people say it's more difficult though as they move up because there's more eyes on them. That means more pressure. And what about for you? It seems like you're continuing to try to be your most authentic self. I want to know why. Why do you continue to do it? What inspires you to continue being your most authentic self in these spaces?
Because it's not easy, and it's not that I don't go through the ups and downs of that, but I'm not interested in like being big, right? Like what I'm interested in is being able to live my life in a way that feel that and to live in liberation, to be, right? And so like my work allows me, as long as I continue to like nurture that and move towards that, allows me to speak from the heart and allows me to do work that I really feel in my heart can be helpful to my community. With the experience that I had, I could go down to DC and get a job as a lobbyist somewhere and make a ton of money and be all right, right? So there's a need, in my experience, to stay connected to that authenticity in order to remain sane and to remember what's real and what matters. And so what real and what matters to me is like my wife, my kids, my community, my friends. And so how do I continue to remember that as I do that work? And when it starts to feel like the getting bigger or moving up or the reputation is like overtaking that, then it means that I don't belong in that space anymore and that I need to do something else. And it does get harder because as you grow, in my experience, like there's more of a realization of more responsibility, and that if I want to break out of this system, then I need to be able to create, I need to like take control of my life and make that happen. And that's a lot of responsibility. It can be easier to just work a job and get a paycheck. And that's okay too. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But for me, liberation is like being able to create my own approaches with my community, with my friends, with my family, to be able to spend my time the way that I wanted, to read a book, to travel. Those are the things that matter to me rather than like clout. Or so even when I'm strategically pursuing that or positioning myself in a way to get that, it's always with an end that's not about that. It's like a tool to get to a place of liberation.
Mi gente, that wraps up another episode of the Quién Tú Eres podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, do us a favor, share, comment, tell a friend to tell a friend. And if there's option to leave a rating and a review, please do so, because it's going to help us in the algorithms to ensure that these experiences get heard by as many people as possible. That's the only way that we're going to redefine professionalism, through sharing our experiences. Thank you. See you next time.